So I think it's fair to say that one of my most requested videos would be a tour of the workshop. I mean, you've all seen various parts of it through the years, but never all at once. So to celebrate 100,000 subscribers, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to give you a short tour. So this is the workshop where everything gets done. It measures at just over 5 meters long and just under 2 and a bit meters wide. In total, it's just over 12 square meters, plus an extra small room for storage. It's certainly not the largest workshop in the world, but it's certainly larger and a lot nicer than any workshop I've ever had access to before. And I've also been quite lucky to have access to this space because I do share it with my grandfather, and there is quite a lot of his stuff in this workshop, and I will be glossing over that in this video. So let's start off this tour with the fly press, which is by the door as you walk in. Now I'm sure most of you should be familiar with the fly press, as I made it on the channel not too long ago. And so far I've gotten heaps of use out of it, mostly just pressing keys and broaches, which is a big advantage because I couldn't do it before, but I've also done a few other cool things with it. Now in the stand underneath it, there was enough space for my 3D printer. This one here is an Anycubic DLP 3D printer. Now this 3D printer is incredibly useful. I used it all the time when I was in university and it got me through a lot of assignments. But I don't think it's ever appeared here on the channel. You know, I have nothing against 3D printers in general. I think they are fantastic when they are used in the correct application. But I think when it comes to these types of resin 3D printers, I mostly see them as prototype machines. I mean, I guess it is in the name, rapid prototypers, but definitely this one, because the problem with this stuff here is, in my view, the resin. The way that this stuff works, if you're not familiar, there's an LCD screen and it shoots out UV light, which cures a UV resin, and that's how it builds the part, rather than melting a filament and extruding it. The result is you can get these super high detailed parts, but the problem is I've never been happy with the properties of the resins you can get for them. Compared to a normal FDM 3D printer, generally the resins aren't as strong, they're not as hard, and they just don't hold up well to UV exposure or general everyday use. Compared to like PLA or acrylic, these things wouldn't hold up if I was to make any 3D printed parts for the workshop. And that's generally why you don't see this on the channel. With that said though, the resins have gotten a lot better since I got this back in 2018, but I still wouldn't use these parts in the workshop. Other situations, sure, but not the workshop. My plan is to get a proper FDM 3D printer sometime next year, but at least for the moment, this is what I have. And before anyone does ask, no, I wouldn't use the press and the printer at the same time. Now to the left of the fly press, in the back corner of the workshop, is a relatively new addition in the form of some racks. Obviously nothing too exciting, but this is where the old bench grinder used to be. Now the bottom racks are just some storage bins and wood, mostly which is used by my grandfather in projects around the house, and I've made sure to keep all this stuff accessible for him. But the next three shelving units are really blank canvases, and I'm still tossing up exactly what to put there. I wouldn't mind, say, a small CNC router or maybe a laser cutter, but all of that can wait till next year. Just know there is a small room for expansion, although I'm sure all of this space will very quickly disappear. Now the old shelving rack has been moved to the storage room to the side, and that will now be used for storage for most of my long or bulky pieces of metal. You know, I only go to my metal supply shop maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and the last time I went was probably back in June or July, so it's definitely time that I go back and get some more metal. You know, people ask me how I plan these projects and how I'm able to get them out on time, and a lot of it does come down to planning. Most of my projects are planned 2 to 6 months in advance so I can get all the tooling and the metal, and that is one big key in how I'm able to get these projects out on time. At the very bottom, I have most of my stuff for casting and stuff to do with the furnace. I haven't done a huge amount of casting on the channel, mostly for 2 reasons. One being, I bought the furnace mostly for heat treating steel, and 2, well, I'm not a huge fan of machining, or I guess using cast aluminium. It tends to be quite gummy, and it's not as strong as, say, a wrought alloy, which is what I normally use, and it does tend to clog up the cutting tools. I have experimented with heat treating and tempering the aluminium to try and improve the physical properties, and I have had some success at doing that, although this is early days. Next, let's take a look at the place you're probably most familiar with, and that is the main workbench. From a filming standpoint, or I guess a narrative standpoint, I always find it really nice to start here, then go off machining, and then come back here to the familiar setting and assemble the part and see how it works. I think doing it this way makes the videos a lot easier to follow. Now in terms of lighting, I think lighting is one of the most important things in a workshop, but especially if you're trying to film it. You know, you can have really expensive cameras. I myself use a DSLR, but if the lighting is off, that is really going to compromise your shots. The big problem for me, obviously, is workshops aren't exactly known for having the best of lighting, and because I have gone from doing occasional shooting to doing, well, a lot of filming, the lighting setup has sort of grown as I've expanded, well, the projects that I'm doing. The current setup that I've settled on is to have an LED panel above, providing even lighting across the workbench. To the left I have a second panel which can be moved, and that does a lot of the lighting, and to the right I have a small ring light which does softer lighting and it gets rid of some of the shadows. It's not the perfect setup, but it works really well for what I do. Now I've had a lot of people ask me about the storage buckets and the pegboard, so let me quickly explain. Me and pegboards, as I'm sure a lot of people do, we have a bit of a love-hate relationship. I think pegboards can be really fantastic, but what I've found is a lot of the off-the-shelf solutions are either overpriced or just flat out don't work. So one thing that I found in the kitchen section of IKEA were these storage buckets. I forget the name exactly, but they're about $1 each, plus the rack, and once they're zip-tied to the pegboard, you know, they work really well. You know, I store a lot of stuff in these and they work a lot better and they're a lot cheaper than anything I've bought that are made for pegboards. All the other stuff for the pegboards are just DIY'd up and they just work better than the off-the-shelf stuff. The Morse taper holders are just a piece of wood, and the file rack is just a piece of wood with a bunch of nails sticking out of it. Another question that I do occasionally get asked is the vise. Sort of, what brand is it and where can I buy it? And the real answer is, I don't know. I didn't buy it, and the only thing that I do know about it is it's a Chinese import and it's probably about 35 years old. With that said though, it has never gone wrong. This thing here is cast steel and it is a solid and it is a strong vise, and it's probably good for another 35 years. You know, compare this to say an off-the-shelf cast iron vise that you might pay a couple $100 for. You know, I would choose this thing over a cast iron vise any day of the week. I've also been asked about the soft jaws, sort of where I buy them. These ones here are specifically from Hafco or Heron Forbes here in Australia, but they're no different to any soft plastic soft jaws that you can buy on eBay. The copper ones though are a DIY job, and they're simply some half-inch copper pipe cut to length and then a slit cut down the centre. You then put them in the vise and then just hammer them into shape, and they tend to work really well. I got the idea off an old gunsmithing video from the 1950s or 60s, and I gotta say it's a great idea. Now next to the vise is my MIG and TIG torch, which is connected to my welder. The welder I have is a Unimig Viper 182. I know I don't do this welder justice, but let's just say it sticks metal together and it keeps metal together even in situations where it probably doesn't deserve to stay together. What can I say? It's a good welder, I think. You know, this is technically just a MIG stick machine, but since it does have the 10 to 25 connector, I am able to connect up a TIG torch and use this as a DC TIG machine. It's scratch start only, and in my experience, scratch starting is not as bad as everyone makes it out to be, but this has been fantastic welding sheet metal. And of course, just to be safe, the MIG and the argon bottles are secured to the bench so they can't fall over. And in the middle of all of that, I have my drill press, which needs the motor and pulley belts put back on. Now, I don't know if you'll remember, but I originally ripped the motor off this to shove on my old mini lathe because the mini lathe motorboard blew. And that was about, what, three and a half years ago at this point. And unfortunately, the old drill press hasn't had all that much work to do. So eventually, I do need to get around to it and get the old motor and pulley put back on. Although with that said, I'm not exactly sure where I'm going to put it. Let's move on to the next bench, which is right next to the first bench. And here we have the lathe. This one here is the new one. It's the Hafco AL250, which I've had for about 6 months. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. You know, for the price that I paid, I think I got a really solid piece of equipment. It's a lot more powerful and a lot more rigid than the old mini lathe. With that said though, there are one or two things that I will need to do with it. For one, I am planning on pulling apart the gearbox and finding out just why it's so loud. As a lot of you probably know, this lathe is loud, even loud compared to other lathes with geared spindles. There is definitely something going on there which I don't think is correct, so I will need to find out. Now in terms of actually lighting the lathe in order to film it, I found that to be quite a difficult task. I think mostly because it is bigger and the whole lathe is white, it just makes it to be quite a difficult thing to film. But after playing around with a few setups, I think I found a setup that works rather well. So in front of the lathe, I have the usual LCD panel, which is just the main workshop lighting. Now directly above it, I have 2 extra LCD panels. One evenly lights up the bed, and another evenly lights up the chuck and the cross slide. At the back are 2 extra LED panels, and this is essentially just lighting for the background. The lighting in the background tends to be quite dark, so this one here just makes it look a little bit nicer. I also have a light which I use to light up the tool post and the cutter. And finally, I have an LCD panel on a flexible arm for lighting up the end. It's definitely a very chaotic setup and it's not the nicest one in the world, but once you crop all of that out and you just look at it on the LCD screen, you gotta agree it does a pretty good job. And ultimately, when it comes to filming these videos, that is really high on my list. Now below the lathe is a trolley cabinet, which I used to mount the Sherline lathe to. And in reach is most of my tool sets and fasteners and the tab and die sets that I use. Most of the normal stuff that you would need in a home workshop. Now next to the trolley is a small rack, and the top is mainly used for welding equipment. And as you can probably see, I have some TIG and brazing sticks off to the side. The rest of it though is dedicated to small pieces of metal. You know, 2 and 3 from the top are for aluminium and brass and a little bit of bronze. And then the next one is for plastics, although I don't tend to do a lot of plastic work anymore. And then the bottom 2, which are the largest, are for steel. You know, I didn't buy these racks specifically for this job, but after using it for so many years, it works really, really well. Now inside the cabinet itself, I have a tool chest which I bought quite a few years ago, and a silenced air compressor for the lathe coolant setup. When I first did this setup, a lot of people were wondering how this setup would fare in the long term, and so far I've had no issues. The air compressor works just fine, and the included fan keeps it very cool. Now moving into the tool chest itself, the top row is mostly used for storing end mills, oddball drills, and taps. My closest supplier has a lot of import end mills, which I buy mostly because they're convenient, but I also make sure to have a lot of Aussie-made Sutton's end mills on hand. Sutton's make really good end mills in my opinion, and whilst they are pricier, they do produce a really good cut and they last for a very long time. The next tray is reserved mostly for milling tools, the few reamers that I do own, and pieces of ground steel. Mostly high-speed steel blanks or W1 or O2 tool steels. And in the drawer below is mostly reserved for lathe tools, and I'll probably be clearing most of these out over the holidays. I have a fair amount of brazed carbide tooling, and I'll probably be getting rid of most of it because I just never find a reason to use it. I'm also planning on replacing most of the insert carbide tooling holders. You know, these ones here are easily 4.5 years old, and I've gotten good value from them. But most of them have picked up a fair amount of damage, and they desperately need replacing. And below all of that are some of the many tools that I've made over the years, which you'll probably see quite often on the channel. And it's probably not easy to see, but at the very back, wrapped up in oil and cloth, is my Sherline lathe. Still deciding exactly what I'll do with it, but for the moment, it can stay there without much issue. Next, let's move on to the milling machine. Now this one here started life as a Sieg X2.7, but after all my shenanigans this year, putting on the 3 horsepower motor and the epoxy granite, This is hardly even a Sieg X2.7 anymore. What this is, at least in my opinion, a very impressive, very powerful little milling machine. You can probably see in a lot of videos just the amount of material I'm able to remove at once, which is just very impressive. Now thankfully lighting the milling machine is a lot easier than lighting the lathe. Apart from the normal workshop lighting, I have 4 LED panels on each side which evenly light up the table and the spindle. It does look kind of rubbish zoomed out, but once you zoom in, it makes for a very good looking picture, which again is ultimately my goal. Now below it are the drawers that I made earlier this year, and really not much has changed since I made that video. But below in the cabinets, which were empty the last time we saw it, I have filled it up quite a lot. Most of it is taken up by the large projects, which get stored here until they're needed again. But at the very back, you can probably see, is the old mini lathe. You know, people were asking me what I did with the old lathe, and I don't know, I get a bit sentimental about these things, and I couldn't get rid of it. For the moment, it's not doing anything, but I am 50-50 on shoving a few stepper motors and ball screws on it, and making it a CNC lathe. Now next to the milling machine is my old tool cabinet. Again, this thing is probably 20-25 years old at this point. And you know what, even when it was new, it was never that great. And after 20-25 years, it isn't any better. You know, all the drawers are a little bit stiff and they're all falling out, but it does its job, and it does its job, well, let's be nice and say adequately. But it has all the tools that a home shed may need, and these are really the tools that I had access to for most of my life. You know, I'm no machinist, and this isn't a machine shop, and you know, some people do ask me how I don't have tool X, Y, or Z, and the big reason is, well, for most of this stuff, I am starting out from scratch. Realistically, I'm just a guy with a milling machine and a lathe and a few basic tools. Now in front of that, I do have a temporary setup for the bench grinder. Next year, I will come up with a more permanent setup with some sort of dust collector and maybe a tool grinding setup, but that's next year, so we can worry about that in, I don't know, a few weeks' time. Now the final thing I do get asked about is, well, how many hacksaw blades do I go through, and do I really hacksaw most of that stuff? The big answer is yes. For most of the small stuff, I do hacksaw it. If I angle grind it, I do show it, but I do all of my angle grinding outside because, well, I don't want any of the dust to get on the lens or throughout the workshop or on the ways of the lathe or the milling machine. In terms of how many blades do I go through, well, here are all of the blades that I've bought since July 2021, and the answer is between 25 to 30. A lot of them have snapped, but there you go, roughly 25 to 30. In terms of brands, I tend to prefer Sutton's high-speed steel cobalt blades because they do last the longest, although they do tend to be a bit more brittle. You can lose teeth quite easily if you're not careful, and they are the most brittle. And that's about it for now. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for 100,000. It's been a great joy and a great pleasure to have been doing this over the past about 3 years now. And I guess I'll see you next week.